Foundation here in the United States. And on behalf of our board members and staff, welcome to this afternoon's forum and discussion on mariage pour tous, the same-sex marriage debate in France and the United States. I'd like to thank Marie-Monique Stekel. Marie-Monique, merci bien, for having loaned us a wonderful sky room. And Marie-Monique is also a longtime member of the board of the French-American Foundation. I'd also like to welcome Al Ross, who is in the back of the room, another member of the French-American Foundation board. For those of you who have been loyal participants in our monthly luncheon series, I'm pleased to report that this lunch today closes out April, where we've had four lunches, not one. So I want to thank the Foundation staff, in particular Patrick Latham and also Katie Fuller, for a very intense month with four very different speakers and events. We picked the day really well. And we actually picked this date for a discussion on same-sex marriage some months ago. We did not realize that the French Senate would act that today, or that the New York Times would have a major story on the issue. And as we speak, France has now become, I think, the 14th country in the world to legalize marriage for all couples. I assume that the president, there are a few other things, and Hollande has to sign the bill. But France, in essence, has legalized same-sex marriage. The point for having this discussion today is not for the French-American Foundation to take a position for or against, but our mission is to find ways to bring the two countries closer together. And one of the ways to do that is to explore objectively key issues that are important to both countries. And regardless of what you may think for or against the issue of same-sex marriage has become extremely important to both countries. And we are very pleased to have a number of speakers today who will explore the subject with all of us. I just want to say, in terms of full disclosure here, that I did extend invitations to a number of representatives from organizations that do have a different view. And those organizations would include American Values, the Family Research Council, the Heritage Foundation, National Review Magazine, Institute for American Values, and also a longtime friend of mine, Chuck Cooper, who's a lawyer in Washington who argued the case in the Supreme Court. Now, some of these individuals had actual scheduling conflicts, but we did, in case anyone's wondering, where is the other side, if you will, we did invite a number of people. But nonetheless, I think that our speakers this afternoon are capable of exploring many aspects of the issue for and against in both France and the United States. So the format is going to be following. We're going to hear first from Jeff Chu, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with Jeff and Bruno Perreau from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, an assistant professor of French studies at MIT, and then Bret Stevens, who is the deputy editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, that many of you know won a Pulitzer Prize last week for commentary. So let me begin with a brief introduction of Jeff. I think there are fewer than 50 books each year that have the privilege of getting reviewed on page 1 of the New York Times Book Review. And Jeff Chu's book, Does Jesus Really Love Me? A Gay Christian's Pilgrimage in Search of God in America, received that honor on April 14th. Jeff has written a very touching book. We actually have copies of the book, I believe, for sale when you leave. I think they're $25 if I'm told, and I think a percentage of the sale goes to the French-American Foundation. So Jeff, thank you very much for that. Jeff is also a young leader of the French-American Foundation. It's our signature program. It's 32 years old. And young leaders are men and women in France and in the United States between the ages of 30 and 40 who, in our judgment, have great potential in terms of the future their future leadership of the country. François Hollande is a young leader, 4 members of his cabinet, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Bobby Jindal in the US. We get it right, Jeff. We get, we're privileged to have young leaders now over 3 decades, and we're privileged to include you in that group. I commend the book to you. I just want to read one paragraph before I turn the program over to Jeff. Many of you know he is a longtime journalist. He's covered China, he's covered philanthropy, he's covered urban affairs, he's worked at Time Magazine and is now the articles editor at Fast Company. But the review of the book had, I think, a very interesting paragraph. Let me just quote it. There's a reference to examples of the people that Jeff has met as he's traveled around the country. The review says, "A million moments like this are playing out all over the country. Taken together, they're building toward a cultural tipping point. And as a result, the marriage of Christianity and homophobia is increasingly harming the churches that espouse it. The damage done by religious bigots used to go one way. Churches preached homophobia, gays and lesbians suffered. Increasingly, religious bigots are hurting themselves." This book took a lot of courage, and I know, Jeff, from just talking with you over lunch, the reaction you've gotten as you've been explored throughout the country has been probably somewhat surprising for you. But thank you for writing this book. Thank you for the courage to write this book, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Jeff Cheer.
I'm really grateful to the foundation for the furniture that I'm now breaking. I was a young leader during 2 years when I was reporting and writing the book, and to have those days with wonderful people from both sides of the Atlantic who have become fast friends and have supported me throughout this process has been both humbling and such a gift. So I have deep affection for the French American Foundation, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. I wrote this book with 3 goals and/or audiences in mind. One is myself. As a gay Christian, I wanted to figure out my faith. I've been told by multiple people that I cannot believe and be gay at the same time. I grew up in a deeply conservative family. And this was a problem for many years I didn't really deal with. So the first audience was myself. The second audience was the American church. I wanted to raise a conversation that's not being had because it's a tricky, difficult subject. We don't like to talk about uncomfortable things, least of all in church when we're supposed to be dressed up and on our best behavior. So that was my second audience. The third is for broader society, because I think both in France and in the United States, we can't understand why hundreds of thousands of people are marching on the Champs-Élysées, or why so many Republican senators, all but one, in fact, 2 now, are against same-sex marriage without understanding the role of faith in society. We can't understand the opposition unless we understand the people who are behind it and the faith that is behind them. So I wanted to take you on part of the journey with me. I visited 28 states in the end. I interviewed more than 300 people, churches from more than a dozen denominations, as well as no denomination, which is increasingly common in America. And the first place I want to take you is to Kansas, to a church that you may have heard of called Perreau Baptist Church. These are the people who hold up the signs at military funerals that say God hates fags. I went there in a very, very hot week in July of 2011. And what I found was, for me, surprising. On a good Sunday in Brooklyn, I slip into a pew around 11:03 a.m., just as my pastor has opened the service with the standard litany. But on my Sunday in Topeka, Kansas, I go to church 4 times, or rather I go to 4 churches. Every Sabbath day, before their own noon service, Perreau Baptist Church's members protest outside other churches as their worshipers arrive. I had asked if I might shadow church members on the picket line, so we're assigned to Team B, led by Jonathan Phelps, an affable lawyer who's the third eldest of Westboro founder Bret Phelps' 11 children. This morning's itinerary features an evangelical Lutheran church, a Methodist congregation, and finally a Catholic parish. It's going to be a good morning, John tells us as we gather. Sometimes it's just Methodist, Methodist, Methodist. This is a good mix. Outside our Savior's Lutheran Church, the 10-person team sorts through the signs they brought along. You can take a fag priest sign if you want to, John says to one of his sons. He tells me that the signs are almost universally applicable. God hates fags works everywhere. He chooses a sign that says Lutheran Fag Church. In 2009, the Lutheran Church had approved the ordination of gays and lesbians. When we move on to the Methodist Church, I spend a few minutes with one of the youngest picketers, a tow-headed, pigeon-toed, 6-year-old boy named Ben. Ben tells me that his favorite thing in the world to do is to jump on the trampoline in his backyard. It's barely summer, yet he's already worried about starting public school in the fall. All Westboro members send their children to public school because they consider their children, who are known to everyone as Westboro youngsters, to be walking picket signs. Ben has heard that his school does not have a trampoline. Also, he tells me, homeschool is more funner. Tucked under Ben's chin the whole time we talk is a child-sized sign that says Fags Doom Nations. Because of the heat, John decides we'll move on to St. Matthew, a Catholic parish, earlier than planned. When we get there, just a few cars are pulling in for Mass, and the picketers are choosing from a range of Catholic-specific signs. Pope in Hell, False Prophet, which features a menacing photo of Pope Benedict, Dyke Nuns. John's sister Abigail, who's wearing a tattered American flag and dragging it on the ground, holds 4 signs at once, including one that says destruction is imminent. The reason they preach is that they never know who will, in their words, have the heart for God, and who doesn't. They believe that spreading their gospel is not just their duty, but their sign of love to a hellbound world. What kind of people would we be, they say, if we didn't tell our neighbors they were going to hell and give them a chance to turn around? Westboro meets on the ground floor of a brick building that doubles as Fred and Marge Phelps' home. They've lived in Topeka since 1955. The decor of the sanctuary just off their kitchen is what I would describe as 1960s suburban ecclesiastical. Standard issue pews, wood veneer paneling, mauve carpet. One of the most remarkable things about the space are the posters that flank the pulpit. One says God hates fags. Another has a photo of the President of the United States and the words fag lover Obama. The sanctuary aptly reflects the church's dogma. While Westboro's attention-grabbing teachers are the unconventional ones, the Obama poster, for example, reflects their belief that Obama is the Antichrist. The church shares many other beliefs with scores of conservative Christians. For instance, they agree with strict Presbyterians on the idea that God handpicks which people go to heaven and which will go to hell. And a host of people across the theological spectrum, from Catholic to mainline Protestant to all manner of evangelical, might quietly agree with the basis for one member's call for homosexual repentance, if not quite his delivery. Quit being homosexual, he says. If you're not doing it, you're not homosexual. Westboro fixates on sexual morality, and it's very strict on these issues. There should be no premarital or extramarital sex. Remarriage after divorce is adulterous. Ben's father, for instance, who is a new convert, was forced to leave his second wife before being admitted as a member because his first wife is still alive. But in promoting such morality, Westboro's members often deploy extremely profane, totally unchurchy language. For instance, at a picket in Manhattan on the first legal day of gay marriage, Margie Phelps, who a few months earlier had eruditely made a winning argument before the Supreme Court, maniacally screamed, "I don't even know what's growing inside your crusty assholes," at gay men who are in line to wed at the Manhattan Marriage Bureau. Westboro's Sunday service, on the other hand, uses a lot more of the vernacular of centuries past, lots of thee and thou. The music is equally throwback. The closing hymn is from 1802. Fred Phelps, who preaches every Sunday, invokes more than a dozen different passages of Scripture in his rambling discourse, which, ironically perhaps, is about the nature of God's love. Few things irk Westboro's members more than the widespread belief beyond the church that Jesus was a sweet and all-loving man. God does not love everyone, they say, only those whom he chose for heaven. One member tells me, God foreordained some people to go to heaven and some to go to hell, but people can't stand that they got put in the wrong category. That's a buzzkill. This kind of thinking isn't actually unique in the American church. Mark Driscoll, a prominent pastor who leads Seattle's Mars Hill Church, which regularly draws more than 10,000 worshipers on a Sunday, gave a sermon in the fall of 2011 in which he said, "Some of you, God hates you. He doesn't think you're cute. He doesn't care if you compare yourself to someone worse than you. He hates them too. God hates right now, personally, objectively, some of you." Tim Phelps, one of Fred Phelps' sons, tells me, "We've got to get off this notion that Christ was a kissy-poo preacher. He was a hellfire and brimstone preacher." Finally, it was time for me to meet Fred Phelps, and boy, did things not go well. I arrived in his book-lined office upstairs from the church sanctuary just before noon. The wall behind his desk reflects the complexity of his history. He was an Eagle Scout. And to the right of his merit badges is a plaque from the local chapter of the NAACP. Before Westboro launched its quest against homosexuality, Phelps, a lawyer, was respected for his ardent advocacy of racial equality. Slouched in an office desk behind his chair, his skin sallow, he looks all of his 82 years. His frosty eyes are several shades paler than his Kansas Jayhawks jacket. It's actually a struggle to draw out details of his personal history. When I try to get him to talk about the beginning of his ministry, he shoots back, "Is that a real good question you got there?" He admits he's always been a rabble-rouser. His father once told him, "Bubba, you seem to know how to get everyone mad and we don't like it. I recommend you take a shortcut and just haul off and kick them in the shins." He says this with a satisfied smile. "I haven't made people mad all the time, but I've come close." After a few more strained minutes of back and forth, he goes for a little kick at my shins. You planning on staying much longer?" "I'll take as much time as you have," I say. "It's 3 minutes after 12, he says, glancing at a clock. He suggests I be out of his office at 5 after. 15, if you insist. I just keep asking questions. In the end, it was my grandfather, along with some stuff I learned in Christian school, that saved me. When I ask Phelps what biblical figures have inspired him, he cites the long line of prophets and faithful servants of God from the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. "The Faith Hall of Fame," I reply, using the nickname for the passage. He seems surprised I have any idea what he's talking about, and for a moment he looks confused. You know something of the Bible?" "I hope so," I say. "My grandfather was a Baptist preacher." He narrows his eyes. "How old was he when he died?" Among some Westboro members, living to what the Bible calls a ripe old age signifies God's blessing. An early death can be an indication of divine disfavor. 91, I say, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude that Grandpa hung on as long as he did. "I think we might be able to have a little bit of friendship," he responds, a touch of softness entering his voice. He cites another line for me from the Bible, from the Gospel of Luke. "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you. When they do that, leap for joy." "When they do that, I dance a little jig," he says. "You must do a lot of dancing," I reply. He turns to his PR guy and says with a half smile, "That was a good one." Finally, I thank him for his time and I ask if I can take a photo with him. He nods and I step around his desk and position myself behind his chair. For a moment, he can't see what I'm doing or where I am, and he startles, turning left and quickly right. "Don't worry," I say. "I'm right here." Many of us are bedtime theologians. For good or for ill, that's one of the few times that I'm alone with my thoughts. And in those 2 quiet moments at the end of the day, when sleep has not yet rescued me, sometimes epiphanies come. Often I get panicky. Always I have questions, and there's no better or no worse time for those big what-ifs. I asked most of Westboro members to tell me the story of how they came to believe, and all of the stories were remarkably similar to Sam Phelps's. One night, he said, "I was lying in bed and I was overcome with fear, a fear of hell. I knew the only way to not go to hell was Jesus. I knew that it's not a question of whether the Lord lives. The question was his blood shed for me? I hope it was, but no man has that certainty. And on some level, absolutely, that fear is still there." I can't count how many times I've thought similar things. How many nights did I spend sweaty and panicked and drained of tears because I thought I might go to hell for being gay, for being me. Other sins I had repented of, but this one did not go away. It was different. It was fixed. Before I went to Westboro, I expected that its members would take every opportunity to remind me that I was going to hell. But in my 4 days in Kansas, nobody ever asked me about my sexuality. Nobody says a word about my salvation except for John, who at one point generically and blandly says, "You know we have to tell you you're going to hell." The closest we come to discussing my faith and my fate is as we leave Fred Phelps' office. Steve, the PR guy, is walking us back to his house. "You're searching for something, aren't you?" he says gently. "I am, of course, but I don't respond." He glances at me. "I really hope you find what you're looking for." He says this so sweetly that for as many seconds as it takes for the words to form in my mind, I think, what if they're right? But just as quickly I know this in my heart. Their God is not my God, and their faith is not my faith, and there can be no middle ground. I cannot believe in a fear-based faith. I don't want to be scared into submission. If Topeka teaches me anything, it is that many words, healing, health, wisdom, love, God, mean such different things to different people. It's almost as if we were speaking entirely different languages, and it's almost as if people are preaching totally different faiths. Westboro was very eye-opening for me. I actually skipped over one part where I write about how charming these people were. Despite the signs that they hold, they were incredibly hospitable and even nice. We talked about Glee, we talked about Harry Potter, we talked about the latest movies. I went over to one person's house for dinner one night, pizza dinner. They invited us over. And as they were asking what we would like to drink, I said, "Well, what do you have?" And he says, "Coke, Diet Coke, Pepsi, Diet Pepsi, iced tea," and the list goes on. And he pauses and he says, "Oh, but we don't serve Kool-Aid because that freaks people out." And there was such a sense of humor and self-awareness that I didn't expect to find. And it really humanized Westboro for me. I think there are a lot of reasons to oppose what they teach, not just the language, but the manner in which they go about their business. But what I realized is that my colleagues in the media have painted a caricature of this church. There are many good reasons to oppose them, but we should find the right ones. There are many true reasons, but we should depict them for who they really are. I want to share another surprising chapter with you. I entitled this chapter Freedom to Marry. And this chapter tells the story of a Presbyterian pastor who identifies as gay. He lives in the Midwest. He asked me not to say where because he could lose his job if his denomination found out that he was gay. I entitled the chapter Freedom to Marry because he made a choice to marry a woman. His name is Jake, her name is Elizabeth. And I want to share a little bit of their story with you. "Every woman fantasizes about the ideal husband," Elizabeth tells me one afternoon as we sit in their tidy living room. "I had my list of 15 things. She wanted, among other things, a guy with strong faith. She wanted to spend much of her life abroad, and she hoped to work with her husband in some kind of Christian ministry. She did not want to live in the suburbs. She didn't need him to have a high-paying job. And in my mind, she says, Jake fit all of those." She pauses and half smiles. "I forgot to put heterosexual on the list." In 2004, Elizabeth met Jake at a Christian conference. She thought he was cute, but given that they lived in different time zones and he was planning to move to the other side of an ocean, it seemed nothing would happen. A couple of years later, she too moved to Asia, and she of course thought of him. But on the day she arrived, he sent out a mass email announcing that he was moving in a month. It was not meant to be. At a lunch at Jake's house shortly before his move, she suddenly had the feeling something was wrong. She went into the bathroom to think and pray. "I felt at that moment he was struggling with homosexuality, and I had to pray for him," she says. "Then I thought, maybe it's for the best that he's leaving. I wasn't sure he was gay, but I definitely did not want to get involved with a gay guy." So their mutual friends, for some reason, encouraged them to get together. And Jake says, "I started thinking about her and praying for her. But it also popped into my mind, I don't think I want to kiss her." He wrote her a letter asking if she would date him. And she emailed right back, "Yes, definitely." But even as they began emailing back and forth every day, the question of his sexuality still niggled at her. She didn't know for sure that he was gay. He had referred in his letter to some mysterious thing that might hurt her. Was that the thing? There was no way she was going to bring it up. She rationalized, if he's gay, he wouldn't want to date me. They went on a 10-day date because they were living in separate countries, and on that date he finally told her. When he told me that, she says, it was the last thing I wanted to hear, but I was somewhat prepared. It was easier for me that he was so upfront. They've been remarkably candid with each other. She asked him about his history with guys. There was none. He had never done anything. He was, in his words, technically a virgin. And they've been remarkably candid, and 7 months later they got married. In my days with Jake and Elizabeth, they never seemed less than open and honest. They encouraged me to ask anything I want, but proved that I can never bring myself to ask about sex. And so it is a great, if somewhat awkward relief when Jake suddenly blurts out, let's talk about sex. Okay, I reply. It's been really good, he says. Okay, I say. One of my fears was that our sex would not match my fantasies. A lot of that is probably just the nature of fantasy. But what we have is a lot better. It's definitely different, he says. You know, it's been very different from what I expected, less intense. It's not like pizza or French fries. It's more of an acquired taste I've come to like even better. He pauses. It's like olives. His wife is sitting there and she's looking bewildered. Which is probably how I look moments later when Jake compares his fantasies to dime store novels and his real sex life with his wife to real literature. Bizarre metaphors aside, the fact that their sex life has been by both accounts not just functional but enjoyable and real, and who can fact check that, raises the question of whether Jake has experienced any kind of reorientation. His answer is no. He doesn't really think much about homosexuality these days, nor do they talk about it, except when people like me ask. He still feels an attraction to men, but the urge to act on that attraction has diminished. Anyway, there are other things for them to think about now. Jake and Elizabeth are trying for their first child. On our last morning together, Jake says something that surprises me. I see my sexuality as a gift from God. I don't think it's just some sort of strange thing that happened, like a part of creation where God wasn't really looking out or paying attention. He uses all things. You know, there's that place where Paul writes about the thorn in the flesh. Who knows what Paul's really talking about, but it's been an encouragement for me. I guess for people with all manner of struggles. If someone could wave a magic wand and make this all go away, would I? My gut says no. One of the most meaningful things my wife has said to me was when she said she was grateful for this in my life because it has made me who I am. I was blown away because I felt really known. We're grateful, he says, even for our wounds. It is difficult for me as a gay man to hear my sexuality described as a wound, as an imperfection. Yet I understand this is how Jake sees it, how he must see it, given his faith and his worldview. Nor are his words, his beliefs, his understanding of his sexuality, and his gratitude for it, born from naivete. Hear the short version of their story. Gay guy wanted to be a super Christian, struggled, got married. And it's tempting to say, wow, he's repressed. But you hear the long version, you sit with them, you listen to their struggle, you understand the incredible work they've done to unpack and analyze and process and evaluate, and things do look different. Will this marriage work? If it doesn't, it won't be for lack of honesty or candor. And if it does, it will be because of their faith, the keystone of their lives individually and their life together. Kierkegaard wrote extensively about how, in faith, absurdity has essential, even is an essential place. Faith isn't about reason. In fact, faith is obstructed by reason. It's not until we set aside the former, until the latter possibly becomes clear. For who would not easily understand that it was absurd, he says, but who would understand that one could then believe it? On our last morning together, Jake baked a loaf of fresh bread. We sat at the table and he opened his Bible to Psalm 62. They read a psalm together every morning. It was written by King David when he was under assault, and the first part of it could not be more appropriate for this couple's journey. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Yes, my soul finds rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. I wanted to go places that made me really uncomfortable. And this was the future that I chose not to have. I chose not to marry a woman. I almost bought an engagement ring when I was in college for a girlfriend. And I felt that on this journey I had to go these places and find these people who aren't written about. Most of the voices that you hear in this book are normal lay people, people in the pews. There are some stories from across the spectrum. I go to a gay church in San Francisco where all but one member is gay. I go to a church in Las Vegas that's gay. Both of them are part of the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a gay denomination. I spent time with a remarkable family in Georgia where the mother came out when her children were 19, 16, 13, and 9. She and her husband split up. She was told that she was demon-possessed by her mother-in-law. Her sister-in-law told her that she was no longer welcome at family Christmas because she was a lesbian. She was no longer part of the family. And over 15 years, this family has gone on a remarkable journey. Today, they spend all holidays together. Her ex-husband, her ex-husband's new wife, all the in-laws. And it was amazing to see how they have processed this issue together and struggled together to stay as a family. I wanted to close my part of this session with one quote from Mary Glasspool. She is the first lesbian bishop in the Episcopal Church in the USA. And I spent some time with her in Los Angeles. Her appointment as bishop was front page news in LA, and she's a remarkable woman. I'm not out there being militant about anything except about the love of God, she says. God's covenant with us is that God has given us more love than our hearts can hold. We simply need to respond. The thing that I learned on my trip is that love means such different things to different people. For Westboro, the most loving thing to do is tell me that I'm going to hell. For other churches, it's to be who I am. It's confusing, it's complex, but this is the backdrop to the debates that we're having in America right now. And I hope that some of these stories might stay in the back of your mind as you read the newspapers and think about how you feel about them as well. Thanks.
Jeff, thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to ask Bruno and Bret to join us, and we're going to. Bret is here, I think. Yeah, there he is. Just a couple of words about our additional speakers this afternoon. And we're really pleased, Bruno, that you could come down from Boston. As I said, Bruno is an assistant professor of French studies at MIT, but he has a distinguished teaching and academic career at the Institute for Advanced Studies here, also teaching in various universities in France, and with a focus on topics relating to gender, sexuality, and production of citizenship. So Bruno, thank you very much. And Bret, you don't know this yet, but you're continuing a tradition at the French American Foundation. Our speaker the week before last was, on a Friday, was Tom Rees. And the following Monday, he won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for his book, The Black Count. So we're very pleased to welcome you and congratulate you on having won a Pulitzer for commentary. Bret is the deputy editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. He has written on a host of topics. He has served as the editor-in-chief at one point for a couple of years at the Jerusalem Post, and has won enormous awards all around the country, including the Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. So again, welcome and congratulations on your Pulitzer. So we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you to the foundation. I'm going to do a very informal presentation about the French case, and we'll be able to debate then and to compare the French situation to the American one, I guess. The first thing I would like to do is to give you an idea of the origin of the law on marriage in France, including its relation with the civil unions, so the PACS, voted in 1999. Then to say a few words about why it is actually a problem for some people in France, and to give a quick presentation of the government on the one hand, that is to the position of the government on the one hand, and then the main opponents to the text on the other. And finally, depending on the time, I will probably say a few words about the very definition of homophobia and the economic discourse on marriage, which is very prominent both on the left side and the right side of the political arena in France. So the context of the PACS, so civil unions, and the context of marriage is actually quite different. The PACS, the need for civil unions in France emerged in 1989 when the highest civil court, la Cour de Cassation, decided not to recognize the cohabitation between two men, and one was actually dying with AIDS, and so there was a dire need to recognize their couple, and that's exactly after this decision that the first parliamentary bills were conceptualized and eventually adopted in 1999. The marriage is actually quite different, because indeed civil unions have taken up a certain number of needs, concrete needs, for recognition in France, in terms of income taxes, for instance, in terms of heritage as well, even if the rights are not exactly equal, but they were still something that didn't exist before. But actually marriage was a debate launched mainly in 2004, and basically for symbolic reasons, because civil unions is only a contract, which means that you remain single in terms of civil status, and this contract is signed at a tribunal and not the city hall, so with no possibility to make it solid. In 2004, after a research seminar where Daniel Perreau, who is a professor of law in France, had made a presentation about European law, a certain number of scholars decided to launch a petition about marriage equality, and the petition was signed by both indeed scholars, but also politicians, artists. And among the politicians, one of them was the Green Mayor of Bègle-le-Bordeaux, which is a city in the south of France. And when, so Noël Mamère, and when he was asked by two men to marry them, he of course accepted because he had signed this petition. And that's actually when the first real debate was launched in France about marriage. The marriage was celebrated, which means that it had legal effects, at least till it was cancelled by a civil court. So for 1 year, for instance, the two married men paid income taxes together. And it was very important because the point was to create jurisprudence and not only to try to lobby the parliament in a context where the majority was a right-wing majority. So that's the first main debate on marriage in France. The second change is, of course, a European change, because Belgium adopted marriage actually now 10 years ago, then Spain adopted marriage, then Portugal adopted marriage, and the Socialist Party was both under the pressure of its partners, the Green Party or the Communist Party, and under the pressure of its international image. And it changed its attitude towards marriage in 2006, and when Ségolène Royal ran for the presidential election in 2007, she incorporated marriage in her program, because she didn't want, and the Socialist Party had to wait for 5 more years to win the election. The debate was not actually in the parliament before 2012. However, if I'm saying this, it's to remind you that the Socialist Party didn't decide in the first instance to support gay marriage. And it might explain a certain number of reluctances with regards to gay marriage, even now, even when they support marriage. And last thing that you should know about marriage, even before the parliamentary debate, is that the Constitutional Council, which is the only constitutional court in France, was asked to state if the actual law on marriage, I mean, the law which is not changed yet because the law has been adopted a few hours ago, but it's near to be promulgated by the President of the Republic and confirmed by the Constitutional Council. So the law on heterosexual marriage, actually. So he had to examine this text, the Constitutional Council, in 2011, and explain that it is not a constitutional matter, which is very important because it's basically only the will of the Parliament to determine the law of marriage in France. So with this decision of January 2011, the Constitutional Council basically explained that even if the law was changed, which is actually the case today, there won't be any kind of constitutional obstacle. So the Constitutional Council will, of course, have to make a decision within a few weeks on the law on mariage pour tous, but it's very, very, very likely that this law will be considered as constitutional. So why is it so much a problem in France? And it's something I discussed with some American colleagues. They are always very surprised that France, considered as a quite liberal country in terms of behaviors, is facing such difficulties to recognize gay marriage. Actually, the main debates are not so much about marriage, but about filiation, about children, about the possibility for a couple of men or a couple of women to have a joint filiation with regards to the child. To give you an example why this is so complicated, I will just, because I don't have a lot of time, mention two things. First, historically speaking, citizenship in France has really been constructed through the civil code on the basis of filiation. That is to say, you become a French citizen because you have had at a certain point in your life the status of children of the nation. It's not by chance that it's the first sentences of the national anthem, Allons enfants de la patrie. This idea that children belong more to the nation than to their parents is part of French history. We could even say that to a certain extent, parents have just the custody of their own children, and they have the responsibility to bring them, to make them good citizens for the state, which is actually a very different conception than the conception of filiation in the United States, where you belong to a community, and the better you are within your community, the better citizen you might be for your country. In France, this direct connection between children and the state is one of the reasons why there is such anti-communitarianism in France. You only belong to one single community, that is to say the nation. And it goes well with a certain sense of privacy, which is not equivalent to the sense of privacy that exists in the United States. Here, privacy, including freedom of religion, is about protecting yourself, protecting your realm against public intervention. In France, it's completely different. It's about trying to determine who can be officially recognized in the public sphere. That is to say that public sphere shouldn't be interfered or shouldn't be bothered by private issues. But of course, what is considered as private and what is not considered as private is based on a certain number of norms, majoritarian norms, and if you're heterosexual and you embody a certain lifestyle that is considered as dominant, you're more likely to reach the status of a public person than if you're homosexual. And if I'm saying that, it's also a very good example of what doesn't change in France, even with regards to the law on marriage. You have very few public figures who are openly homosexuals, in particular in the political area, which is not the case at all if you look at the United Kingdom, for instance. So there's also this reason, this difference in terms of what the privacy mean. And final reason, there has been increasing emphasis on the body in France for the past 30 or 40 years. The body as the core of the national identity. It can be explained for many different reasons. If we have more time, I can give you more details about that. But it's in the context of the 80s where you had new possibilities of assisted reproduction, new possibilities of filiations, where a certain number of bioethics committees were created, and actually they were pretty conservative, and they actually tried to limit, to frame these very technical possibilities, not to make them individual rights, but only to medicalize them. So that's how we have a law in 1994 that prevents not only surrogacy, but limit assisted reproduction to heterosexual couples married or living together for at least 2 years, and with a medically proven reason for benefiting from assisted reproduction. And it's actually the first time that in the law heterosexuality became a legal condition for benefiting from such a system. And it even impacted adoption. I worked a lot on adoption. It was the topic of my last book. Adoption is a system in France which is open to both married couples and single people over the age of 28. You can adopt in a single or plenary way. So single way, basically, the adoptive filiation is added to the biological filiation. It's mainly used for intrafamilial adoption. You adopt the kids of someone you have married. You also have plenary or full adoption, where the adoptive filiation replaces the biological filiation, completely replaces it. Which means that, given that you can adopt as a single person and a married couple, and in a full or plenary way or simple way, you can legally have in France 1, 2, 3, or 4 children, which is far from the vision of the traditional family. But even this system was impacted by the new vision of the body and the need to protect the body and to restrict procreation to heterosexual couples. So basically, after the law of 1994 on bioethics, judges and social workers started to change their approach of adoption itself. If you were a single applicant for adoption, even, of course, homosexual, your file wouldn't be considered, but even heterosexual single applicant, if you wouldn't prove to the social workers that your adoption was conceived in the frame of a heterosexual couple, in the frame of a future as a heterosexual couple, that is to say you want to marry someone, for instance, you wouldn't be accredited, which is a radical change in terms of the perception of the family. And this focus on the body has also to be understood in the political context of the 80s. This is a moment of the right of the extreme right in France, with a focus on the same body as a condition for being a good citizen. If you remember, in the middle of the 80s, Jean-Marie Le Pen was talking about the need to put HIV positive people in camps. That is to say, to keep the social body as sane as possible. And finally, it was also a time of celebration of the French Revolution, celebration of the body of the soldier, the body of the person who gives what he, the main thing he has, that is to say, his body, to the nation. So there is a sort of a philosophical shift here, which puts so much emphasis on filiation as a problem of national identity, and not only a question of creating a family, hence a certain number of fantasies and fear in France. And to be to talk now about more recent issues. That's one of the reasons why you have on the left side a quite mild support of gay marriage, actually. If you looked at the introduction of the text itself, what we call in French l'exposé des motifs, no, there is nowhere the word equality, which is quite telling. In Spain, it was both made in terms of, in the name of equality and dignity. In France, the philosophy of the text, the justification of the text, is actually based on the idea that there is now a majority of French people in favor of gay marriage, but no real philosophical deep commitment for the text. And you also saw that when François Hollande explained to the Assembly of the Mayor of France that if they were against gay marriage, they had the possibility not to celebrate gay marriage. You have seen that as well when they decided to not to present at the same time in the law, to put in the law marriage, adoption, and assisted reproduction. So given assisted reproduction was removed from the text, it of course gave the message to the opponents of gay marriage that if something was removed from the text, then why not something else? Why not adoption? And why not eventually something that would be like super civil unions and not marriage? And the text itself remains a text, sort of a double-speed text. For instance, what we call a présomption de paternité, which makes the husband automatically the father of the children when the children are born in the marriage, will not exist for gay couples. So in gay couples, the spouse will have to adopt the children, the biological children of his or her spouse. There's also a difference in terms of names, what kind of name can be transmitted. It's a little too long to explain, but there remains sort of small areas of inequality, even within the text on gay marriage. As for the opponents themselves, if you have read the press and watched news, you might be quite surprised to see that actually cohabits Brigitte Bardot with sort of a nightclubber woman, a party girl, Catholic herself, with more traditional Catholic groups, and of course with a certain number of members of the parliament from the opposition, from the right. So how can they cohabit together? Because everything Brigitte Bardot represents in her life, in her trajectory, should be hated by the people with whom she works. But something has changed since civil unions, which is actually the very perception of homophobia. It's not as legitimate to be openly homophobic. During the 1998-1999 debates on civil unions, a certain number of members of the parliament were awfully insulting with regards to gays and lesbians, talking about comparing them to animals, asking them to sign the pacts at the vet rather than in a tribunal, and so on and so forth. What actually happened, and it's probably one of the main positive things of civil unions, is that people started to debate on homosexuality, and the perception of homosexuality started to shift. So that now, and there's even a law protecting people against homophobic discourse is now in France. So what is actually impossible now is to be directly homophobic in terms of public speeches. So, and of course, in France, with its fantasy of being a secular state, it's even more difficult to only claim, apart from a certain number of small groups, but for the members of the parliament, that they actually vote the law because they are guided by their faith. So Brigitte Bardot was the sort of the ideal character for them. She had a history of being surrounded by gay men. She looked a little more fashionable than traditional Catholic groups, and she was very good with the media, and so she could become their spokesperson very easily. But it doesn't mean that at the same time the opponents to the text were necessarily distanciating themselves from more traditional groups. And so we have now sort of a double strategy with the spokesperson, with a strong strategy targeting the media, but also more radical group belonging to the extreme right. So that's the difference between Le Printemps Français, the more radical groups on the one hand, and La Manif pour tous, which is Brigitte Bardot's movement. And they can do the dirty work without having to make the opponents to the text too traditional or too old-fashioned. And last thing, because I probably reached the end, what is also very interesting if you look at the demonstrations in France against gay marriage is the kind of signs, the kind of posters they use. Most of them, graphically speaking, are inspired by leftist movements. You will see Gavroche, so this young Parisian worker boy. You will see, red fists, and you will see workers saying what is important now is economic issues and not issues of marriage. And even more interestingly, now that the debate is going on for more than 1 year, even on the left side, some people are saying, well, let's get rid of marriage, let's vote the text, and let's come back to what is actually important for our electors, that is to say economic issues. But in both cases, there is a major misunderstanding. Marriage is about economy. Marriage is about transmitting your patrimony, your money. It's an economic question. Second of all, it also shows that even if there has been debate on marriage for at least a year, there were very few debates on LGBT cultures and what it means to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual in France nowadays. Because if not, people wouldn't have in mind the stereotype that marriage is not an economic issue, and which basically means that marriage is for white, male, urban, and with a high level of income. So this stereotype of homosexuality has not really been undermined by the debate themselves. And not talking about the fact that homosexuality can be the source of pauperization. And you have a certain number of studies in New York showing that a large number of the young homeless population is actually LGBT. So the new battle, the new struggle is actually beyond law. It's really the battle of norms, the battle of representations. How can people be more aware of the diversity and the complexity of LGBT identities in France?
Thank you. Bret?
Okay, I'd rather not use the microphone if that's okay. Can people hear me?
No.
You want me to use the microphone?
We can hear you.
Can you hear at the back?
Can you hear me a bit? Well, I'll use the microphone. I'll be very brief. First of all, thank you for having me here. I feel a little bit like, I don't know if you remember about 20 years ago when Ross Perreau ran for president. He had as his vice presidential pick this character, James Stockdale, and you remember that famous debate where he said, "Who am I and what am I doing here?" And that's kind of the way I feel right now. I have a casual connection with the French-American Foundation, a very happy one. And I don't speak French. That's probably because my every attempt to learn it was defeated in Belgium, so you can blame it on the Belgians. I am politically probably so far to your right that I should be dangling out of the window somewhere over there. I guess I probably should mention I'm straight and happily married to the same woman for 10 years. I think the reason you've asked me to come here is because I recently wrote a column called The Conservative Case for Gay Marriage, which I feel quite strongly about. And I just want to make a few very, very brief points about why I felt this way for a long time, and then finally, sort of spur of the moment, because I didn't know what to write on Monday morning for a column, decided to put these thoughts together for a column, which is what brings me here. But I feel that people who describe themselves, at least in the American context, I really can't speak about the European context. I think conservatism, at least on the continent, means something very different from what it is or ought to mean in the best sense here in the United States. But I think people who are conservatives, people who traditionally vote for the Republican ticket, should be delighted to see gay marriage being accepted in one state after another, should hopefully be cheering for Supreme Court cases that overrule Proposition 8 in California and overrule what I think is one of the most Orwellian laws in history, the Defense of Marriage Act. It's this bizarre law that defends marriage by denying a whole category of people marriage. But let me just make 2 or 3 very brief points, and then we'll move to discussion. First of all, most Republicans or most conservatives in America come from what you might call a liberty tradition. And you believe that by and large, individuals should be left alone to pursue bliss as they see it. And there is no bliss that is more personal and has less to do with other people's views and opinions than who it is that you want to spend the rest of your life with. So from a purely liberty position of personal liberty, individual freedom, it's always seemed to me very strange that the Republican Party typically takes the view that on this one matter, people should not be allowed to choose their life partner and be able to bring 2 things together that marriage uniquely brings together, which is to have to find love and respectability in one and the same person. I think that's kind of why we have marriage, right? So that you can, you don't have, this is not, I shouldn't say this, the French tradition, some mistress where you find love and then wife, well, I've just said something horrible, I take that back. So that's one side. The second side of it, which I think is very important, is if you read and it's worth doing, read the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were the people who were opposed to the ratification of the United States Constitution. The Federalists weren't just Jay and Hamilton and Madison, but a whole panoply of thinkers who were making the arguments in favor of the Constitution. And if you look at these debates, what the sort of central theme that emerges is that the Anti-Federalists are great believers in, essentially in virtue. They believe in the Minuteman spirit. They kind of look to Greece, although not in the right way. They look to Greece for sort of models, Greece and Rome models of manliness and virtue. And the point of view that comes out through people like Hamilton, Madison, is a properly ordered constitutional republic has the job of channeling the passions. Passions cannot be repressed. They often ought not to be damned. They certainly shouldn't be put underground. They need to be channeled in some kind of socially productive way. And in fact, when you think about what capitalism is, it takes this passion that we typically call greed and puts it to some socially productive function. Democratic systems take these passions, the passion essentially for power, and it manages to channel them in ways that make it possible to live in an ordered, democratic, representative, choice-driven republic. Well, what goes for political passions or what goes for passions for lucre should go for passion itself, the passion for who you want to spend your life with. And it seems to me that you can have one of 2 possible ways of going about it. You can say we should be channeling those passions and making them as respectable as possible by creating this institution so that gay men and women can have marriage, a real institution, not civil unions, not some sort of second-class, lower form of union, but marriage itself. That should be the institution that we provide to channel these these passions in a socially productive way. The alternative is what you might call the Larry Craig model, which is that you become a Republican senator from Idaho, and every now and then you go into men's bathrooms and you tap your foot and they claim you had a wide stance. Now, Larry Craig is a tragedy, and for himself, for his wife, for his children, it's a very sad thing. I mean, I think people need to get their head around what it means that because we have denied the institution of marriage to gay men and women, many of them have been driven, because they're searching for respectability, to go into traditional male-female marriages, which I heard you speaking about just as I entered the room, so I'd like to read or hear more about that. But you know, the result is, you know, couples that probably all of you know in their lives, where he is just not interested in her, or she's just not interested in him, and really at the heart of that, there's a great deal of sadness. Everyone knows these sorts of stories, and you see it, and you say, you know, what a pity that that person felt, for a variety of reasons, religious convictions or social conventions or so on, that he couldn't look to find love and respectability in one and the same person. Two more quick points that I guess I'd like to make. You know, one of the arguments that was made, actually it's been made on both sides of the marriage debate before the Supreme Court, is what the social science tells us about whether gay couples are raising children with as successful outcomes as heterosexual couples, and people say, well, social science isn't really settled, and so on. And I totally agree. I think social science is a lousy way of going about making these sorts of, I think, fundamental moral and commonsensical judgments. I mean, conservatives are often actually very suspicious of social science for many of these same reasons. I mean, you could have a social science study or studies that tell you that people who have IQs below, I don't know, 80 shouldn't get married, right? But you would never actually accept that. I mean, it's horrendous. Or maybe you would say that couples of mixed race marriages would end up having negative social outcomes. But of course, you know, the whole thought of that is just horrendous. Whatever the social science shows you shouldn't be dispositive about the kind of conclusions you reach. So what conclusions should you go to? You need to go to anecdotal conclusions. You know, I love how everyone says, oh, Manhattan really doesn't belong to America, and you never really see what's happening in the real America. I don't believe that at all. I think Manhattan is the real America. I think everything else is a sort of pale, demented, second-rate imitation. But, you know, so one of the nice things that you see, actually, when you live, as I do, on the Isle of Manhattan, is you actually meet same-sex couples, and you meet same-sex couples who have children. In fact, my youngest child, who's 3, her best friend, is being raised, the best friend is being raised by a same-sex, a male same-sex couple. Loveliest people in the world, and they're raising a wonderful little daughter. And so, to me, the experience of the anecdote, of the first-hand evidence of seeing this very committed gay couple responsibly raising this beautiful little child who's my Katya's best friend, that to me is much more interesting than social science studies that say, you know, one thing or that lead you to one conclusion or another. Second point is, you know, in the 1990s, a lot of conservatives were saying, you know, we're becoming this Balkanized society in which everyone is an African American and Irish American and Asian American, whatever, and we need much more pluribus unum. We need to be a much more united society. Well, over the last 15, 20 years especially, probably longer, but at least, you know, in my sort of conscious political lifetime, what gay Americans have been saying is, we want to participate. We want to be part of this America, and that means that we want to serve in the military and even die for our country, or we want to be part of this most basic social institution, which is known as marriage. So that's great, actually. You know, I mean, anyone who's married thinks that anyone who wants to get married is probably a lunatic. But, you know, that being said, if you want to participate in our lunacy of monogamous, serious, committed relationships, which last one long, boring lifetime, you know, I mean, I understand how liberals could be against gay marriage, because why would you want to do, but I don't understand how conservatives could be against gay marriage, because we want people to be as boring as we are, right? And I guess the last one I want to make is, marriage is a very important institution. I think it's hugely important, and you look at children who are being raised in broken homes or by single parents, or you know, sort of no parents at all or whatever. And that's a serious problem. I mean, traditional marriage has sustained some very heavy blows in the last 40, 50 years, from thanks to deadbeat dads and kind of Murphy Brown moms and all this sort of stuff, Las Vegas weddings and no-fault divorces. But if straight people want traditional marriage, they should practice traditional marriage. I mean, that's the best way. Nothing has so trashed the institution of marriage as straight people pretty much doing whatever the hell they damn well please. So, I mean, it just strikes me as bizarre and hypocritical for a lot of conservatives going on saying, oh, the institution of marriage is being threatened because gay people want to join the institution of marriage, as opposed to the rest of us are shacking up with wife number 3 for a 6 to 10 year commitment, you know, with a prenup. So that just strikes me as, you know, in the Argo, also Manhattan, a little mashugana. So I'm just, you know, I am of the view that if you are as crazily right-wing and conservative, and I'm not like some David Brooks, like nice conservative, I'm really a right-wing crazy conservative. Any sort of sensible, like, you know, I have a colleague who says, you know, that certain propositions vanish in the presence of thought. And I think the conservative case against gay marriage is one of those propositions that just vanishes in the presence of thought. So I'm going to stop there. I know this is kind of a I know nothing about really the topic at hand. I don't pretend to be an expert, but I just wanted to offer you a kind of, you know, tsunami of expression and opinion in the time that I have. Thank you very much.
There are members of the French press here, so you've now probably become a hero in France for some of your comments. Thanks to all of our speakers. I want to begin the discussion by trying to hone in on the topic of religion and how it relates to this debate in both countries. And Jeff, I want to start with you. One of the voices that I sadly missed during this debate is the late Christopher Hitchens, who wrote a book called God Is Not Great, which became a bestseller just at the time when he was diagnosed with esophageal. Christopher wrote a bestseller called God Is Not Great, and became a bestseller. Then he did a biography, Hitch 22, and unfortunately his life was cut short with esophageal cancer. But I suspect if Christopher were here, Jeff, he might ask you, why are you still a Christian? Christianity preaches tolerance and love and respect, and in many of the examples you've experienced, it certainly wasn't reciprocal. So do you expect to change the church? Why are you still a believer?
I'm not religious for strategic reasons. I don't think it makes sense to talk about religion in the context of on-off switches. You can't choose to be an atheist one day and then choose to be religious the next. The Kierkegaard quote that I cited in the book, it's absurd. There's something absurd about religion, and sometimes we try to put it in a rational framework, and at a certain point you can't have that conversation. I can't persuade someone to believe, and they can't persuade me not to. So you can have an amusing conversation, or could have with someone like Christopher Hitchens, but it's not going to be a rational exchange of views. It just doesn't work that way.
Why isn't there a greater sense of tolerance among religious believers? In other words, why the God hates fags?
Well, those are just the loudest people. There's only 40 members in that church. They're disproportionately influential. There are many Christians in America who would completely disagree with that, and one of the conclusions I came to, which I don't think is original to me, but it is something that I agree with now that I've done the book, is that there isn't just one Christianity in America. There are 2,000 denominations in the United States, and the religions are unrecognizable to each other. These are not people worshiping the same God. Westboro does not worship the same God as I do. They happen to, unfortunately, fall under the same umbrella, such that when you read the newspaper, Christian could mean any number of things, and evangelical could mean any number of things. These labels have become so useless because of the diversity.
Are there different heavens and different hells then?
Sure. You ask my husband, I'm not sure we would agree on what heaven and hell are. Completely different views. So diverse that it's kind of a joke to call it one religion.
Bruno, let me bring you into this and ask about the role of the Catholic Church in France. And Jeff, you may want to comment on the Catholic Church in the U.S. That's a large church. How many members worldwide? Over a billion. 25% of the American population is nominally Catholic. I'm not sure what it is in France. Probably higher, although maybe not practicing. What's the role of the Catholic Church in this discussion in both countries?
The number of people who identify themselves as Catholic is around 55% in France. But the number of people who practice religion is actually below 15%.
It's about 4%, according to the church.
Yeah, well, yes, but then it depends what kind of practices. So it depends if you consider regular practices, that is to say people who would go to church regularly, or people who would just go to church once or twice a year, for instance. So the statistics by the INSEE, so the National Statistics Institute, are slightly larger than those of the church itself, the Catholic Church itself. The first thing which is quite important to say is that France is a secular state to the extent that civil marriage are not celebrated by churches at all. So if you want to be married, you have to go to the city hall, and your marriage is celebrated by the mayor of the city hall, which is not the case in the United Kingdom, for instance. So the debate in the UK on marriage was actually much broader, because you can be directly civilly married if you are married in a church, which of course questions the reason why all the main religions were asked to give their expertise during the parliamentary process about civil marriage. So there is this ambivalence in France with regards to both having a completely separate system, but at the same time a civil system which is still mimetic to the different religions. And it raises the question of the sacrality of the state itself. To what extent a civil marriage expresses another form of sacrality. That is to say, expresses rights not only in terms of what you can benefit or not benefit from, but something symbolic which is at stake. And all the debates were around this notion of symbols, and in particular symbols with regards to the children. The other thing that I wanted to add, if you don't mind, is that if you look at the different criteria that are the criteria at stake with civil marriage in France, some of them are directly the result of religious marriage, that is to say, faithfulness. To get married, you need three things in France. You need to be able to assist your spouse and the family of your spouse. You need to cohabit in a way or another, and you need to be faithful. Interestingly, with marriage in the UK, I might stop here, but there was no condition of faithfulness for gay marriage. So the legislator in the UK decided that gay marriage, unlike straight marriage, won't have this condition of faithfulness.
I'm sure that will be litigated in the United States. Bret, let me ask this. The religious right is typically, in the United States, the religious right is typically associated with the conservative side. Where's the disconnect here? Why has the religious right seemed to abandon this, their principles when it comes to this issue? In other words, principles of libertarianism, which you would normally associate with the more conservative end of the spectrum. Why the disconnect here?
Well, actually the mystery is why the religious right gravitated to the Republican Party. You know, that was up until 1977 when a right-wing religious lunatic named Jimmy Carter became president of the United States. The religious right was a bipartisan phenomenon. And then After Carter, it moved very much into the Republican camp, although there are still elements of the religious right who vote the Democratic ticket. I think I've seen different figures, but 20 to 30% of people who consider themselves evangelical Christians will vote for Democratic candidates because there are other issues they care about, union membership or whatever. Now, the interesting question is whether an issue like gay marriage will sort of drive a wedge between this never entirely comfortable alliance between the religious right and kind of Wall Street conservatives like people like me. And, maybe it will, and maybe in the long term that's to the good. You look at the history of American party affiliation, people gravitate to certain parties, and it's a changing sets of coalitions. There was a time when the Democratic Party was associated with extremely hawkish foreign policy, whereas Republicans were skeptics of foreign policy interventions. And you can imagine a Kennedy intervening in a place like Iraq, but not necessarily a Nixon. So these things shift over time. I was very struck by the response to my column and the number of people who were quoting verses of a New Testament in which I do not believe I'm Jewish to prove what a heretic I was or whatever. Which I kind of you sit in your office and you think this stuff is hilarious. My hope, though, and Jeff probably, I'm really fascinated now to read his book, but my hope, though, is that there must be some. Let me put it this way. I just got an email from this guy that was a retired Navy captain, really right-wing guy, very, very evangelical, and he sent me a kind of meditation he had on how he should feel about the Tsarnaev brothers, these characters in Boston. And the conclusion was Christianity enjoins him to look for mercy and forgiveness. Now, if you can love the Tsarnaev brothers, but you can't love your gay neighbor, that's weird. I mean, that logic can't be sustained. And I suspect that, and I've heard some statistics to this effect from Ken Mellman, who's former head of the Republican National Committee and very engaged in the human rights campaign for marriage equality. Among younger evangelicals, you see a real movement towards acceptance of equality and of marriage. And that's a very hopeful sign. I think it has to do with sort of broad social changes in the United States, just a kind of a different sort of awareness. I was a teenager in the 1980s, and that was probably the last decade where, as a matter of sort of common parlance, when you're a teenager, you call someone a fag. And you're just like an offhand insult. And then that began to change, I think, very, very healthfully in the 1990s, when people became much more aware. Was it, the AIDS crisis? What was it? But there was a real expansion of consciousness and of sensitivity. One of the nice things about American politics, excuse my language, but there's a general thrust in American politics which basically enjoins us not to be assholes. And I shouldn't have said that. But people, however slowly, get to that point. That there's something kind of so cruel, so capricious, so invidious about saying to two obviously in love people, no, you can't get married, and you can't have what we're having. And I think that is a shift that's taken place very visibly over the last 20 years, very positively. That's one last point. Conservatives always think the world is going to hell. And then we're kind of surprised when actually, no, things are kind of getting better, and a newer generation has something to teach an older generation. And that's what's happened, I think, in this case. And good things. This goes to show that this is a greatest country in the world.
Are you old enough to remember All in the Family? Did you watch that?
Well, I grew up in Mexico, so I didn't watch TV.
Well, I'm wondering, some of you may remember that program where a relatively, ignorant conservative Archie Bunker found a way to explore some very important social issues back in the 70s. Do we need something like that now? What's the role of media in France and the US in helping understand and explore these issues?
We already have Glee, which is amazing for teenagers. I mean, to add on to what Bret was saying, for younger evangelicals, it's not just the broader social change, it's the fact that in almost every high school now, there's some kid who's out. So there's a face to the issue, whereas when I was in high school, there wasn't a face to the issue. And that proximity does amazing things. It's harder to tell someone that you know and have known for years, I hate you and you can't get married, than it is to tell this mythical gay person who's having sex in the West Village that you've never been to. And I think, you know, the personalization and the humanization of the issue has changed things for a lot of evangelicals.
Let's open it up for questions. If you would just stand and introduce yourself. And do we have a mic? Or you want to shout?
I'll shout. My name is Brendan Riley. One thing that I found interesting, there's a problem in the Catholic Church, at least, that there's canon law arguments that you can't practice homosexuality. So that overrides anything about marriage because the practice is not allowed as part of it. And what I think, if you differentiate that with birth control, 90% of Catholics use birth control. But birth control is not something you have to show up in church to get. I'm very serious about this. People can ignore these things easily that are rules in the church, but when you get to the point where churches, sacraments, or institution have to be involved with it, that's what's hitting here. In some ways, yes, everyone, young people are very much saying it doesn't matter, but they're hitting up against the rules and in some points the foundation of the church. I
think that it's interesting. There are actually parishes that are openly rebelling against these rules. I spoke at a to be unnamed Catholic parish where they've done 2 lesbian weddings. This is not something that the Pope knows about, as far as I know. It's not something that the Archbishop knows about, as far as I know. So there are these acts of ecclesiastical rebellion. I think not just the Catholic Church, but a lot of churches are going to be in trouble if they don't have an open conversation about these things. If they just say, this is what canon law is, now fall in line. Because what the people in the pews are craving is some kind of discussion. People my age and younger, I think, have a level of acceptance that you're not always going to get your way, but if you tell people just to shut up, that's not going to work so well.
Although, you know, can I just say, I don't think it's anyone's business to tell this or that denomination who they can or cannot marry. If the Catholic Church doesn't want to marry gay couples, pity for them. I think they're going to drive away a lot of people. But that's why we have religious liberty in this country. You know, churches do what it is they want, and it should not be the role of any kind of government to tell that church, you must marry this couple. Or I mean, this is also central to what the United States is about. The lucky thing is religious liberty means 1,000 churches. And we will get more churches that I think take a different view and are prepared to do this. The marriage that I'm advocating is civil marriage, obviously, but religions can do whatever it is they want. And look, every religion practices its own particular form of insane bigotry. But it's true. But you know, that's what the nature of a free society is about. You know, you just say, okay, you have a ridiculous, preposterous set of beliefs, and by all means, be our guest. That's America.
I think there is something clearer about Europe where they separate the civil marriage from the religious marriage, and I think it would be a better model in some ways. Let the churches do what they're going to do, and have the state marriage be different.
It brings the question, it also brings the question of equality back in the picture, not only the question of liberty, which is indeed important, but what is at stake is their very combination. If you only think in terms of tolerance or acceptance, it also means that you think from your own perspective. That is to say, you tolerate someone. So there's always a certain condescending dimension, or at least you take your model, and often your majoritarian model, as a model to think about minorities' lives. And equality is conceived somehow differently. It's not about being the majority of a minority. You have to be protected for who you are, and this is also a dimension that cannot work without being combined with liberty and vice versa.
Another question from the audience. Al, and then the gentleman here. Al Ross, and then the gentleman back here.
I want to thank Bruno for a really interesting expose of a fairly complex mosaic of the cultural factors that really are determining the opposition to this question in France. And I don't think I'll ever be able to listen to the Marseillaise against without thinking that this whole oppressive state is sort of sucking up these children. But I really want to ask you a legal question, because I was surprised at your opening remarks that the Conseil Constitutionnel had not really thought that this was a constitutional issue in the law that presently above, which shocks a little bit, I think, Americans who think that there are a lot of protections concerned with equality in the Constitution. And my question is, suppose that the law that was debated and passed in Parliament today was more or less a French version of our Defense of Marriage Act, which said you cannot get married to someone of the same sex. Would that have been something that the Conseil Constitutionnel would have said, not our issue, it's up to Parliament to say?
Yes, absolutely. It was exactly the decision it made, because by definition, marriage till now is marriage reserved to a specific category, even if this category is a huge category, which is the category of heterosexual couples. But it's actually a law that states that marriage is reserved only to a specific category. And the Constitutional Council said it's not a constitutional matter. So having said that in 2011, there is no reason for the Council now to say the opposite in 2013, now that marriage will be open to another category of people.
So,
hello, my name is Ben Vient, and it's an interesting conversation. And I want to throw something completely different out here. And I'm curious, this is a minority viewpoint within the LGBT community here in the States, and I'm curious how it plays out in France, which is what degree it is right now. But, you know, Bette Midler, several years ago, when she was asked about gay marriage, she kind of famously said, sure, yeah, but what if they didn't? What if they kept going forward with what they're doing? Might they show us some different, better way that we form our relationships as humans? And I know that in the LGBT community here in the States, it's a bit of a minority viewpoint, but why should we be buying into this institution? Might there be other ways? There are other movements out there. There are thruples. I don't know how commonly this word is used, but the idea of thruples. Why is it one person? Why not? Why not 3 people? And it's a minority viewpoint. And to your point about why conservatives are buying into it, I think it's wonderful, but I kind of think that there's a bit of a fear. There's a bit of a fear that what LGBT people might be progressing into with their relationships is somehow scary to some people. That it might redefine the concept of relationship being 2 people. And I'm curious in France where that line of thought may play out.
I might give you an example with regards to adoption and how adopted couples are perceived in France by social workers, and then made a slightly broader comment. When I studied adoption, so I went everywhere in France, it's a local competence. So basically it's local agencies which are responsible for accrediting parents for adoption. And I made all kind of social science research, and you can clearly observe that the way social workers justify their decision to accredit or not to accredit a gay candidate for adoption is based on the very perception of what is a heterosexual couple. So you can be accredited if you can be compared to a heterosexual couple. That is to say, if the social workers can identify what makes you similar to a heterosexual couple or as good as a heterosexual couple, you can be officially accredited for adoption. If you claim that what makes you a good parent is part of your experience as a member of a gay community, for instance, your sense of friendship, other forms of solidarity, you won't be accredited for adoption. So it raises this question, that's why I was ending with that, the question of norms. How can we go forward and to develop a richer world that is not single-handedly focused on one way to live? And then, of course, indeed, give equal rights to people, because they all contribute in their very way to the good of the community. And to say it differently, I remember that in 1972, there was one homosexual group in France, very famous, le FARS, so the Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire, and they had a small newspaper, and the title of the newspaper was 2 exclamation points. So what we want everything. And in the everything, it really meant that it's too easy just to ask for rights if it's by renouncing to a certain number of elements of your history. It is also too easy just to stay in the margin. And actually, when you're conservative, you need people in the margin, because the people in the margin, they define yourself as central, as normal. But when you start and claim that you want everything, you both want marriage and you might want to tap your foot in a public toilet, and there's no problem with that, and it doesn't make you a worse citizen. That's something different, and that's where politics actually start, because you combine together potentially conflicting behaviors or ideas, and you make them productive.
Well, you've raised the issue, among others, of the legality of the former Mormon practice of polygamy, or the Muslim practice of polygamy, which is legal in many parts of the world. So you're getting into issues of social norms and values, which then ultimately are codified or not codified in the legal systems that are then enforced. So.
I think the answer to your question very succinctly is you can't eat your cake and have it too, or have your cake and eat it too, whichever. I mean, as you can see, I'm passionately in favor of the right to marriage for lesbian and gay people. But what you're suggesting, I think, is wrong and dangerous. Wrong because polygamy introduces a power dynamic in any kind of set of relationships in which one person loses out, or several people lose out, have an inferior power status. I think that's actually sort of commonsensical, but also it's why I think most people find the concept of polygamy sort of inherently degrading, especially if it's one man and his 12 wives. It's dangerous, I think, also for politically, I suspect, I think it's dangerous for the lesbian and gay community, because a major political investment has been made in saying we want to participate in this institution, and you're winning that battle, and a good thing too. And then to say, oh, and by the way, we were just kind of joking. So we're those frivolous people you suspected all along who aren't really serious about anything. And that would, I think, introduce or reintroduce a level of anti-gay animus that would be, over the long term, quite scary. You know, something quite wonderful is happening in America, but that's because it's a coming together of 2 essentially political insights or political traditions. And then say, well, actually, never mind that. We just took you through this 25-year national conversation so we could decide we wanted thruples because thruple sounds delicious. You know, I want a thruple too, right? But that's not how it works. Or my wife would have something to say about the thruple. And I think that
maybe she wants one.
It's German.
But of a different kind than yours. Of a different kind than yours.
well, some hypothesize why, okay, right? So it's just something I think that needs to be borne in mind. I mean, what has happened is, I think the gay community has entered politics in a really serious and very healthy way. But politics is a serious game, and you have to think about what consequences are for them saying, oh, you know what, never mind, we're just now expanding the menu to infinity.
Jeff, we're going to give you the last word.
I agree with Bret.
Do you have a question?
There's something about the options. Hi, my name is Nicolas Chamberon. I'm living in New York with friends. And I have one thing that I would like to, maybe Bruno, you can point out, is the contradiction that the right wing is right now facing in France is, first, they were historically, the right wing was historically the party who was making the familial reform, which was never at all the left-wing field. So I think it's one thing that it is interesting to understand, because the right wing has now, we can see that the economic reform is kind of a cul-de-sac for the left, and they know that they can fight on that new field for the left wing, which is the politique familiale. So that's one thing. And the other thing is about the adoption, is that, and you're kind of specialist about, so you know about this, the states organized the adoption has erasing part or the complete roots of a child. And I think that the right wings never realized this contradiction was so big. And this does not work with a gay couple. Because if he could say before, this is your dad, it's legally your dad, even if it's not. Now, with a gay couple, you cannot say that this is two dads or two moms. The gay couple has to tell the truth, the whole truth to their children, which was not at all the case with the family adopting a child before. And I think that's very important, that that's one of the reasons why they're so against gay couple having kids. Because they have to face also these kind of issues. I mean, there's plenty of things, but I'm sure. Hang on.
In terms of family policy, I don't agree with you, actually, because if you really track how the evolution of family policies in France, let's say since the middle of the 60s till now, there is a real continuity between the left and the right, or actually, historically speaking, between the right and the left. If you look at, for instance, the first family policies by the Mauroy government, which was the first socialist government under François Mitterrand, with the minister was at that time Georgina Dufoy. She was married with 6 kids. She's now against the law on gay marriage. And she was surrounded by a certain number of high civil servants who were all educated around la Fondation de Jacques Delors, and to advise at that time both de Gaulle, Pompidou and Giscard d'Estaing. So the natalist policy in France is a sort of a common feature, whether it's the right or the left. You might have a certain number of changes in terms of the way these policies are actually advertised, explained, but honestly, if you look very carefully about the content of these family public policies, they are pretty much coherent and constant in the past few years. In terms of adoption, well, I have to say something about why this law of 1966 can erase everything about the children's or the child's origins. There was a famous case in the 50s and early 60s with a child who was basically between two families, the adoptive family and the biological family. At first, the biological family didn't care of the child and has agreed to abandon the child and then changed their decision. And it's on the basis of this case, because the child was basically in custody in a family, then in another, then in the first one, and according to the different court decisions. So the law was really made for the best interest of the child, to secure its very filiation, so that the child only belongs to one single family and could fully identify with the parents and so on and so forth, and feel more secure. So that's the context, indeed, and that's why this law, which was passed by a right-wing government, didn't make any kind of problems in terms of origins at that time. Now things are different, you're right, with gay adoption, because you cannot pretend that you're actually the biological parents as a couple of the child. But it's not the first time. With the development of international adoption in the 80s, the problem was exactly the same. If you adopt a white kid and you're a black couple or vice versa, you cannot pretend being the biological parents of the child. But actually, at that time, it didn't make any kind of problem, which is interesting, because if things were only about the verisimilitude of filiation, there should have had a major public debate. And those who oppose gay marriage and adoption now, in the name of the verisimilitude of origins, didn't do that. So what, or didn't, fight against international adoption. But what is actually at stake? It's not so much the origins themselves, or the knowledge on the origin, because in France you can also give birth anonymously, for instance. You have l'accouchement sous X. And this is something that is legal for at least 30 years in France. But what is at stake is the very representations of heterosexuality as the core, the source of filiation, and the power, the social power in the imaginary of heterosexuality as the core, the source of any kind of family form. So, and this leads to citizenship, to what makes you become a citizen, how you become a citizen, what kind of role model you should try to play to become a citizen. So it's more about citizenship and heterosexuality and their very assemblage, rather than the question of the origins themselves.
It just seems to me that if I were the child being adopted, it really wouldn't matter to me where my parents came from. I have no choice in it, and that the most important thing is whether there is a loving relationship for that child. And let me just close with a quote from my favorite writer in the world, who actually happened to be a closeted gay man until shortly before he died, and that was E.M. Forster, the famous British novelist who had a great phrase in the Passage to India called "God is Love." Thanks very much for being with us.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it was really fun. Oh, it's true.
How do you do? Nice to meet you. How do you do?
Something about the black cat.
Oh yes, well, it's, I haven't read it, but I hear it's a fantastic book. No, I won another Pulitzer.
About what?
For commentary. I'm a columnist.
No, I just I thought you said, oh, I'm sorry.
There was some, I guess, the Black Count office here previously, but that was I am not that person. Thank you very much. Thank you. I read about foreign policy.
Tunisian festival. The ambassador of Tunisia is coming for opening. Because I'm interested in
I remind everyone there are copies of
I don't think there is a role for women in Tunisia anymore.
Yes, it is.
Nice to meet you.
He'll stick around for a few minutes, maybe sign one if you're lucky.
Hi.